Hello everyone, a very good morning to all of you. Today we are going to discuss the daily Hindu analysis of 21st November 2023. Now today we have a lot of articles which are important from both prelims and mains perspective. So first and foremost, let's have a look at all these topics that we are going to cover in today's session. Now, when it comes to today's session, there are three important topics that we see which will be very crucial from your mains perspective. And these are the first three articles that we are going to discuss in today's session. So first session here, which is very important, is making sense of the employment channel. Now, when it comes to this article, this is something which has been a much talked about subject for almost last 20 odd days. And we'll discuss in depth about what exactly has been presented in the editorial column that we have today in the Hindu. Second, the Bangladesh garment workers unrest. Now, this is also one very important topic from the context of some economic aspects of Bangladesh, plus a very important context it has in global warming as well. So we'll try to understand both the context with regards to this particular topic. And then the third topic is how free cancer care alone won't help fight against cancer in India. So these are the three topics that are going to be discussed at length, and these are areas from where we can expect some kind of question also to come, and we'll discuss those kind of areas from where they can potentially ask you a question in the mains examination. So these are the topics that we are going to discuss from the mains perspective. And then from the prelims perspective, there are certain other topics which become crucial. Now here, the first topic, again, this is not something which is new, and this is a topic that has been much talked about and has also been in some kind of controversy as well. So these two topics are something that we'll discuss together, and some of the topics, some of the areas related to these two topics will be also discussed together. So we'll discuss that. And then one small development that we see is about the National Pharmacy Commission Bill. So this is again from the perspective of prelims examination we'll discuss, and also remember that this will be a developing story. So over a period of time there will be more news that will come in. And then lastly, more finance needed to wean India's electricity grids off coal. So this is again something that is important from energy context in environment and ecology, and also partially from science and technology perspective. So these are all the topics that we are going to cover in today's session. Now, to start with, the very first topic that we have is from page number 6, GS3 Economy, and this is making sense of the employment challenge. Now, the context in which this topic is being covered today is the context that you might have heard, and this is when Narayan Murthy had said that India's work culture must change and youngsters here should work 70 hours a week. And while saying that, he also had put in some logic, and he had also given some data about what has been happening with few of the countries after World War II and how they worked a lot, and they were working more than 70 hours a day to reconstruct their economy. And that is how they started becoming very good powers, very important powers in economic context in the entire world. So this is basically what he was referring to. Now, since then we have seen that there has been a lot of debates around this particular topic, that what he said, whether what he said is correct or not, whether we should consider his opinion here or not. And there have been a lot of challenges that we have if we want to implement something like this. And the context in which this particular news article has come in today is that the author says that it's not necessary that only increasing the number of hours of workforce will solve the problem in India. There are things that we have to take into account, and that will only help us understand the issues at hand, and then probably try to solve those issues based on all these information. So what basically has been raised here, there are two questions that we potentially are trying to answer. First is, do longer work hours solve the problem for us? That's the first thing. And second, the comparison that we have done, the comparison that Mr. Narayan Murthy had done was with countries like Japan. He had mentioned countries like Japan and Germany. and how they reconstructed themselves after World War II. So that was the context in which he had said. So whether this comparison is valid, and the author here, he also brings in another context of another country, and this is South Korea. So why these three countries have been mentioned, we'll discuss that as well. So these are the two things that we have to address, and this has been addressed in this particular article. Now, the very first thing to understand when we talk about the workforce, and we talk about the number of hours of working and whether the number of hours itself is a solution, there are two important things that we need to understand here, and something that has been discussed in this article. First, about aggregate demand and labor demand. Now, when it comes to aggregate demand, we'll try to understand these two concepts first, so that we can put it in the context of what the article has said. Now, what is aggregate demand? So aggregate demand basically is nothing but the total demand for all the goods and services in an economy at any given price level in a specific time period. So the total demand for all the goods and services. Total demand for all the goods and services. Now, when we say total demand for all the goods and services, we also have to understand that what are these components, what are the components of this demand, and how is the demand being created in an economy. So there are a couple of important components which help you understand how exactly demands are created. So first basically is on the basis of consumption. Consumption from normal households all across the country, how exactly are they consuming, what is their consumption pattern. So that is something that becomes very, very crucial for us to understand. And then from there on, one more thing that basically makes very, very important component is the investment that the businesses are making. So for example, if we are talking about longer work hours, we basically are talking in the context of how many people can be employed in a given let's say factory, or let's say any kind of institution or any kind of company, any firm. So if let's say we are talking about the number of people being employed, we also need to understand that the business will be able to employ a lot of people only when they have that kind of demand. And that demand also comes from the investment, that the investment that is being made on the capital goods, such as the machinery and the factories. That if we see the firms investing in factories, investing in machinery, investing in the infrastructure, it means that they would then be able to create a demand for labor. They'll be able to employ a lot of people if they have been able to create this kind of infrastructure. So that's why investment becomes a very important component of improving the aggregate demand. Similarly, the government's spending also becomes very, very crucial, because when it comes to the public goods and services, the expenditure that the government makes will be a very, very important indicator of increasing the demand. And then lastly, the net exports that the country has. The basic difference between a country's exports and imports will be again a very, very crucial factor, and the gap that you have between them. So if let's say, for example, if your exports are more and imports are less, it means that we are producing more in the country, and that is something that is going outside the country. So that means that there will be a demand for labor that will be created in the country. So that's why all these things, they contribute to the aggregate demand, and this is something that will create demand for all the goods and services in any given economy. Now, in this context, another thing that we need to understand is the labor demand. Now, labor demand, again, when it comes to labor demand, this basically refers to the labor that firms and employers are willing and able to hire at different wage rates given the level of production and demand for their goods and services. Now, in this particular scenario, what we see is that when it comes to the labor demand, there are certain factors again which contribute to generating this labor demand. So for example, the product demand itself. Now, first and foremost, when it comes to product demand, if let's say there is an increase in the demand for products, then in that case, a particular firm will have to hire more people to cater to that demand, right? So for example, certain companies selling, let's say, textiles or selling electronics, if their demand is high, if the demand for their products is high, then in that case, they would have to produce more. and if they have to produce more, they would have to employ more people, right? So if product demand exists, then they would have to employ more people, correct? They'll have to employ more people if there is a product demand for a certain firm. At the same time, technology also has a big role to play in case of labor demand. Now, the impact of technology can be both positive and negative, right? Impact of technology can be both positive and negative. Now, why exactly am I saying this? That technology can have both positive and negative demand or negative influence. Positive how? Because sometimes when you add new technologies, when you are able to upgrade yourself as a firm, if you are able to upgrade yourself in technology, you probably will be able to create more better demands for the products that you have, and that in turn will be able to create new employment opportunities for people across. So for example, we have seen that a lot of areas where new technologies have come in, we have seen that they have grown. Take a very simple example of mobile phone industry. That in the mobile phone industry, as new technology has been added, newer features have been added to the mobile phones, we see that there have been an increase in the demand for labor, because the firms are doing new things to their mobile phones, they are adding new features to their mobile phones. So for that, to do that, they would need more engineers, they would need more workforce, both in management, operation, and in product creation. So that's why in that sense they would create a positive influence. But at the same time, technology can also create a negative influence. We have seen that what's happening also in the world right now is that because of a lot of processes being automated, they are actually losing their demand in the they are decreasing their labor force, because the technology is able to take care of a lot of labor force. So that's why with automation, a lot of people who would have been employed in certain kind of operation will now be completely replaced and are being replaced by softwares, machines, and automated systems. So that's happening. At the same time, even in the software industry, in the tech sector, in the last 1.5 years, we have seen that because of the technology upgrade with artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence, etc., coming into the picture, we have seen that there has been a decrease in demand for labor. So that's where technology can have both positive and negative impact. Then after that, the production cost. Now, when it comes to production cost, which also includes wages, etc., what may happen is that if these are high, let's say if the labor cost is high, if the production cost is high, then in that case, we might see that the firm might become selective in hiring. They might not hire a lot. So that's why then it can lead to decrease in demand for labor force. So that's why production costs have to be low to increase labor demand. Because this will improve their capacity to hire. It will improve their capacity to hire, and they'll be able to hire more people. Then economic conditions, overall economic conditions also matter a lot, because any country which is in a very good economic shape will have that money to spend, and that's why the companies and firms there also will have that money to spend, and that's why they can have more labor demand, and they'll be able to employ more people. And at the same time, the government policies also, a lot of times it matters. The kinds of regulations, the kind of labor market that they are creating, or the minimum wage laws that the any given government or any given country has, all these things will matter a lot. So that's why aggregate demand and labor demand becomes two very, very important indicators when it comes to understanding of what are the numbers that are required, and how exactly or how many people can actually be employed. So what we basically see is that the demand for labor is directly linked to the aggregate demand, and that's why we'll see that when it comes to an increase in aggregate demand, it will be driven by factors such as increased consumption spending or government investment, etc., can lead to higher production levels by the firms. So that's why these two become very, very important, and that's why only working longer hours will not necessarily lead to an increased employment, because it's not about you going and working for 70 hours. First and foremost, you need to have that opportunity, and opportunity will only be created when there is an aggregate demand, and which is being catered to by the labor supply. So that's why first and foremost there have to be these opportunities, and once the opportunities are created, then only it even comes to whether or not you can work for long working hours or not. First and foremost, you need to understand the issues at hand, and the issues basically are related largely to the fact that the number of opportunities are down, and when the number of opportunities increase, then only we can think of improving upon the working hours, or improving upon the total output that we are getting out of that labor. So first and foremost, create that demand. Long story short, create that demand for labor so that people can first be employed, and then only we can think of increasing their productivity levels. Then coming to what was being discussed, and this is in the context of Japan, Germany and South Korea, what we have basically have seen is that there have been extensive reconstruction efforts, and that's why there were a lot of financial aids also that many of these countries received post World War II, because it was like a complete reconstruction of the entire economy. I mean, you can say the entire country, the way they had been devastated in terms of not only economy but also in terms of the workforce, because there were a lot of casualties as well because of the World War, and that's why the number of people who were even available to work was very less. And that also is where we need to understand the difference between the countries like Japan and Germany versus the current context of India. That in that scenario, post World War II, they were in a situation where there were not a lot of people who actually could be even employed, because a lot of lives were lost, and the even the human capital available for them was actually very less. And that is where we need to understand that there's a big difference here, because here we know that we have a population, and the number, I mean percentage wise, even if we don't go percentage wise, if you look at the sheer number of people who are unemployed, you know that this number is very high, and that's why this is not a comparable scenario. And secondly, so this is one. Secondly, there was a complete reconstruction that was happening, so obviously there was a lot of demand for labor, and that could be catered by people working for longer hours, because the availability of labor force was less. And secondly, there was a strong nationalistic element also that came into the picture, and this is basically was about rebuilding your country, rebuilding the nation, and at the same time also having a nationalistic approach, because we were looking at a scenario of us versus them, that this country has suffered a lot because of actions of foreigners. This was the, you can say, mentality of the thought process after the World War II scenario in all these countries, and that also led to a lot of people working here a lot and also giving their best so that they can reconstruct the economy, they can reconstruct their country. So there was this nationalistic element also that came in this particular scenario. So that's why there are these two things that make these scenarios very special for countries like the Asian countries or Germany, where we saw that there was a huge increase in demand for labor, and they were actually working for very long hours. Now, coming to what is the strategy for India, because these scenarios that we are looking at, we understand that why we can't say, according to author, why we can't say that the situations are comparable, and that's why just demanding that youngsters should start working for 70 hours and so on will not be a direct solution, because there are other factors at play. So when it comes to what should be the strategy for India, how can you improve upon that labor demand in India? First and foremost, we need to tap into the global market. The first thing that has been suggested is that India has to tap into the global market, making sure that the Indian goods are more competitive globally. Indian goods are globally competitive, and this is where we have to channelize our energy to understand that we have to improve our productivity first and foremost, and in the Indian workforce, in the physical infrastructure also we'll have to have to invest a lot. So these kind of investments and improving upon the productivity of the Indian workforce first of all is required, so that globally we can become competitive, and that is where we'll start to gain some momentum in the global market. So that is one strategy that is required for India's growth. Secondly, expanding the domestic market by reducing the cost of food production also is very, very important. That we need to understand that our cost of production in food is also very high. That also means that the food that we are buying is also very high. Obviously, if let's say the resource price itself is high, the production cost itself is high, so in that case the selling price will also be high, and selling price being high also means that our food consumption will take up a lot of money out of our spending capacity. So that also makes a lot of issues, creates a lot of issues. So that's why we have to understand that we need to expand the domestic market by reducing the cost of food production. Because so basically what happens is that when you reduce food production cost, when we reduce the food production cost, it means that we would have cheaper food available. Correct? It means that we would have cheaper food available, and cheaper food means that now you'll be able to save more, right? So what in turn happens is that our spending capacity increases. Spending capacity increases. We'll be able to spend more. We'll be able to spend more on non-food items. All right, we'll be able to spend more on non-food items, and that is something that is required, because when you are able to spend on non-food items, it means that you are creating a demand for consumption of all the other things. So when your demand for consumption increases, the production demand will increase, and if production demand increases, the firms will need more labor force to meet that demand for production. So that is the second strategy that probably can work for India. Because if you look at this, and this was a report that was published by World Bank, if you look at the spending patterns of India versus other developing nations, you will see that in food and beverages, the spending, the amount of spending that we have is the highest, 44.6%. Correct? So 44.6% of our money basically as a national average is going on only food. So that's why food production cost is less. If we are spending less on food, it also means that we'll be able to spend more on other products and services, and hence it will create a demand in the market, and hence then it will lead to more demand for labor force, and this is what will be one of the ways in which we can improve upon the labor demand in India. So that's why there are all these things that have been discussed in the context of this particular article, and becomes a good article to read and understand the economic context of the 70 hours work hours. Right? So this was one very, very important article. Now coming to another article, and this was an article that has been published on your page number 8, and this is the Bangladesh garment workers unrest. Now when it comes to the garment industry in Bangladesh, there is something that becomes very, very crucial for us to understand: the context of what's happening there, and all the indirect topics which are linked with this particular protest that has been happening in Bangladesh. Now let's try to understand it. Let's try to understand it. That first and foremost, what exactly are we looking at? So what we have seen is that in Bangladesh, since late October, we have seen that in the ready-made garment industry, in the garment sector, we have seen that the workers have been demanding a significant increase in their mandated minimum wages from 8,000 Bangladeshi taka to almost 23,000 Bangladeshi taka. So that's the kind of demand that they have here, that this needs to increase by almost 3 times is what they have asked for. Now we need to understand the context of the ready-made garment industry in Bangladesh. Now overall, when you look at the significance of fast fashion in Bangladesh, what we see is that Bangladesh is world's second largest exporter of fast fashion, and it follows China. China is the highest, and after China, it's Bangladesh. And then it accounted for almost 85% of the country's export earning in 2022, totaling a total of $55 billion. At the same time, we see that a total of 8% of market share globally is of the RMG sector. So that's why we know that, because it's a very significant amount that Bangladesh contributes, and hence for Bangladesh economy, it's a very, very crucial part. And that's why whether it comes to any international market, especially the European markets or the US market, we see that there are all these markets which significantly have a very, very important role to play in Bangladesh's economy. So that's why for Bangladesh, the significance of fast fashion. Now, also understand the term fast fashion here. So fast fashion basically is when we are talking about garment industry and we are talking about textile companies which produce a lot of clothes, which produce a lot of different types of designs, and they basically run the fashion industry in the entire world. Here when we are looking at fast fashion, we are not really looking at the longevity of the clothes and clothes that you can buy and you can wear for 10 years of time, but rather we are looking at a consumption where we see that there are people who will be buying clothes all the time, who will be buying clothes, let's say, every month, and every time they visit a shop, they go shopping. Shopping generally is synonymous with buying clothes, right, in most of the cases. So this is what happens, and in these kind of scenarios we are looking at fast fashion, and there are a lot of biggest brands of the world which are called as fast fashion brands. For example, brands like H&M and Zara, etc., they're called as fast fashion brands because what they are producing is for fast consumption, for swift consumption, and they're not looking towards longevity of clothes. So that is one thing that matters here, and that is why there is so much of demand that is being created. It's also for, a lot of people who would want to keep up with the trends and every changing fashion statements every now and then. So that is where fast fashion comes into the picture, where you perhaps don't have people like us who are just looking to buy one piece of shirt that they can wear for maybe next 5-6 years. So that is what fast fashion means, where your fashion is changing fast and you are buying very fast. So that's why for the ready-made garment industry, it's a big part that it plays. Now, when it comes to Bangladesh, there are certain issues that we are looking at in Bangladesh's economy context. That first and foremost, the inflation rates that we saw in October 2023 reached to up to 9.37%, which corresponding to the same month last year was 7.23%. So that's why there is an increase in the inflation rate in Bangladesh, and we see that even the forex reserves for Bangladesh also, they have also decreased significantly, that they used to be almost $48 billion in 2021, and they have come down to less than $20 billion mid-October in 2023. So that's why we see that there are these issues that already are grappling Bangladesh, and that's why we see that the garment industry here plays a big role. Now, when it comes to this garment industry, the unrest is on one side and the political instability that it creates is a big challenge, because there is an upcoming election in Bangladesh next year, early, I think, in the month of January. So there are all these issues that we obviously have with regards to the unrest, the economic and political instability that it can create. But at the same time, we also need to understand the carbon emissions and with regards to the RMG sector, because in this scenario it's not only about Bangladesh, but it's also about global warming and the concerns regarding global warming and how the ready-made garment industry is related to it, and not only with regards to the carbon emissions, but there are other environmental issues also which are related to the garment industry. So that's why we need to understand these things very importantly from GS3 perspective, that when it comes to the fashion industry globally, it contributes to almost 2 to 8% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world. And in case of when it comes to Bangladesh, more than 25% of all the emissions that happen in Bangladesh is basically because of the textile and RMG sector. So 25%, almost 1/4 of all the emissions that happen in Bangladesh, it's only because of this one industry, the garment and the textile industry. So that's why we see that there have been a lot of issues with regards to how they are being operated, and there are problems that are associated with it. And that's why we understand that this becomes a big challenge altogether for a country like Bangladesh. But when it comes to this sector, we also need to understand the environmental issues and the role of textile industry in creating these environmental issues, because there are a lot of problems that we look at when it comes to the environmental issues created by the textile industry. So for example, when it comes to the textile industry, it is a very resource intensive industry, right? It needs a lot of resources, so a lot of energy is needed, a lot of water is required. So water requirements, energy requirements, these are huge when it comes to this. And at the same time, the raw material required, the raw material that is required for this industry to function is huge. So for example, let's say cotton industry or cotton cultivation. So cotton cultivation obviously is largely related to the textile industry. So cotton cultivation, when it comes to it, the way cotton is being grown, the amount of water consumption that happens in cotton is also related to the garment industry, correct? Because the same cotton that you're growing with a lot of water being used there is also going to be used, I mean, it will also going to contribute to the garment industry. So that's why we see that overall water consumption, not only in production of raw material but also in the final manufacturing and production in the garment industry is also huge. So whether it is about the finishing of the clothes or the dyeing of the clothes, so we see that here also water consumption is high. So water consumption comes from what point? Water consumption first and foremost could come from agriculture, like cotton, growing of cotton, or it could come from the finishing of the textiles, or in the dyeing of the textiles. In all these cases, we'll see that the water consumption will be huge. Water consumption in all these cases will be huge. And at the same time, the problem also is water pollution. That it can lead to. So that also needs to be understood well in this context, that how this can be a big challenge to the entire world. At the same time, the energy consumption at each and every process or each and every step of the process, right from the raw material, growing of the raw material, then after that finishing of the raw materials, the transportation, and then all the processing, the factories, everywhere the energy consumption. So energy consumption is huge. Now this energy consumption is largely coal based. And that also creates an issue, because then your consumption of coal and obviously the emission of carbon dioxide because of this increases a lot. So that's why we see that is a big challenge altogether. And then after that, one major challenge also has been waste generation. So from the context of waste generation, we understand that there are a lot of things. For example, the scraps that you have, the leftovers that we have, plus from the processing, a lot of chemicals that are being released. So there are all these things, plus the pollution that it causes. So we see that there are all these things, a lot of textile or the material related to textile, they end up in landfills. So that also creates one of the issues in this context. So there are all these things that we need to understand with regards to the role the textile industry plays here, and then at the same time the impact that it might have on biodiversity. Because cultivation or agriculture, or let's say increase in demand for all these things, might lead to a lot of deforestation activities, and that in turn leads to a lot of loss in biodiversity. So that largely is mainly because of deforestation and habitat loss. So that's why from that perspective we have to understand this. And also when it comes to the role of industry, we also have to understand something with regards to the microfiber pollution. Now, with regards to microfiber pollution, we are talking about basically the very small particles which are even undetectable a lot of times and untreatable a lot of times. They go untreated very easily and just mix with the aquatic life, with the marine life especially. We see that these kind of issues have been there. You might have heard about the issues related to microplastics and how they have a very huge negative impact on the environment. Similarly, we see that there will be a similar role here also that it would play. So that's why there are all these issues that we need to understand from perspective of the situation. Because just let's say, I mean, if I just give you the data with regards to all these issues, for example, when we are talking about water consumption, if I just give you one data, so for example, a data says that if you just produce one cotton t-shirt, just production of one cotton t-shirt in certain ways can take up to 2700 liters of water, can lead to consumption of up to 2700 liters of water. So just imagine the kind of situation that we are talking about, looking at the entire industry and each and every one. And this is not a random data. This was a data that was published by World Wildlife Fund, that is WWF. So that's why we see that this is big challenge. And at the same time, there was again another data that was published by the Global Fashion Agenda. So the data that they had published was that almost 20% of all the water pollution, 20% of all the water pollution in the world just comes from textile industry. Just comes from textile industry. So you have to understand the problems, right? You have to understand the problems that things like these are actually creating. So there are a lot of data that substantiate that how difficult the textile industry, or let's say unprecedented consumption in the textile industry, can become a big challenge. Now, at the same time, one more thing that I would say that is indirectly related to this kind of a scenario when we are talking about the textile industry largely, is how our consumption habits are related to climate change. Many a times when we think of climate change, we only think the biggest of the problems. We think about, okay, fine, the coal consumption is high, the electricity demand is high, so that's why coal production is high and carbon dioxide is being emitted in a very large quantity. The vehicles, the four-wheelers, the two-wheelers and the airplanes, etc., are leading to a lot of leading to a lot of air pollution, etc. So we think in a very big sense, we think in a very macro sense, but when we look at our own consumption habits, we'll find that energy consumption from our each and every day activities are very high, right? It goes from our transportation habits to our eating habits to our consumption habits to our buying habits. You'll see that in each of these cases, even we as an individual are also creating a lot of issues. Now, we don't think of ourselves when we are thinking of this kind of a situation of global warming and climate change. We think that, okay, this is what the governments are doing, that India and China are emitting a lot of emissions, is what US would say. We would say that look at what they have done for the last 250 years. But we stop thinking about what an individual is contributing. And that's why this is where we need to understand from various perspectives that how exactly even we are leading to a lot of issues. So whether it is about consumption habits, or let's say whether it is about our food or our transport, or our energy needs, the waste that we generate, fast fashion is a big contributor in this particular scenario. There have been the issues related to single-use plastics that are being used, that are being raised all the time. So, and even the e-waste that we are generating, the electronic waste that we are generating, that only the announcement of new phones itself, we see that a certain company announces that they're launching a new phone, we just go and buy, even if we don't need it, we want it. So every year we'll probably go there and just buy the new version, just because we can, just because we have that kind of money in our hands, we do that. So that's why we see that there are a lot of issues that we are looking at with regards to all this, and from all the perspective of the various consumption patterns that we have, we at an individual level also need to understand this. So that's why these kind of things are something that we can expect in your mains examination also, that at a micro level, what is our carbon footprint, what is our own contribution to climate change. So we need to understand all these specific issues as well, so that we can actually understand how we are also contributing, and what do we need to do in our lives to make sure that we are not the ones creating the issues. Then coming to one more important topic, and that is something in your page number 9, and this is about how free cancer care alone won't help the fight against cancer in India. Now, when it comes to this particular article, this article basically is talking about the financial burden that cancer puts in. That we know when it comes to cancer, there are problems that we see, and there are a lot of problems that we need to understand and take care of. But at the same time, we also need to see how exactly cancer has a big dent, or cancer is putting a big dent in people who are suffering from cancer, who are trying to fight cancer, and the families of the cancer patients. So that's why it's about more about this financial burden that we are looking at. Now, overall, some of the data is something that they have discussed in this particular article about what's the present scenario with cancer and what are we expecting in the future. So for example, what it says is that it is estimated that by 2040 there will be an estimated 2 lakh people who will be diagnosed with cancer every year in India. This is a big number that we are looking at, because cancer, we all know that the treatment of cancer first and foremost can be financially very challenging for a lot of people, and at the same time we don't even have a good success rate in curing cancer. We know that there are a lot of deaths, and it has been one of the leading causes of deaths in India. So right now, for example, we see that it is the third largest contributor to deaths if we leave aside some of the cardiovascular diseases and the infections. After that, we see that cancer has been one of the leading causes of death according to what has been published in this article. And at the same time, we know that this burden is only going to increase with a lot of differences that have come in our lifestyle, in our eating habits and lifestyle habits, and the consumption patterns. Each and everything will also lead to a lot of new issues that we probably haven't seen until now. So that's why we have to understand this scenario from the perspective of the examination, that how exactly these things will shape up. So that is what this article basically has been discussing, that if we look at the context, so the context here is that estimated almost 20 lakh people, 2 million people per year will be diagnosed with cancer in India, making it the third leading cause of death in the country. So that is what we are saying, that cardiovascular diseases, infections, and then after that cancer. So from that perspective, we understand that we need to solve the problems related to cancer, and even it is expected that it will surpass infections and heart diseases as the leading cause of death in the coming years. So that's why there are things that the governments have done, whether central government or the state governments, they have taken steps, but at the same time only those steps are not enough. That is what basically it talks about. This particular article is basically discussing that particular issue, and it was a basic case study that has been taken with from the perspective of Delhi, that from the perspective of Delhi and the people who are suffering from cancer in Delhi, what are the issues that they have flagged. That for example, even if there are government facilities available, there are government hospitals available that can treat cancer at either a very cheap rate or even for free. But the way they are treating and the time period of waiting, etc., also becomes a very big challenge altogether. So that's something that we need to address in this particular scenario, that in India right now, when we are looking at cancer as one of the leading causes, the financial burden of cancer is huge. And that is what basically has been discussed in this particular article. Now, when it comes to cancer, we need to also first and foremost understand that how exactly we need to see cancer and what is the context in which we need to see cancer. So the basics of cancer, I'm sure many of you would be aware of. But first and foremost, when we talk about cancer, what exactly is cancer and what kind of disease is cancer? So in cancer, what we basically see is that there will be an uncontrolled growth and development of cells. Uncontrolled growth and development. Now, what do we mean by this? In general, what happens is that inside our body, we have a lot of cells, right? Every inch of our body, every part of our body has cells all around, right? These cells, they would grow, they would develop, and they would die, and they'll be replaced with new cells. And this happens every second. This keeps on happening every second. Just to give you the context, that by the time I just complete one sentence, almost 10 lakh cells in my body would be replaced with new cells. So this is how the body functions. But in case of cancer, what may happen is that some of the cells may not die and they keep on developing, they keep on growing. And that is what develops as something called as tumor. Alright, that is what develops as a tumor. Now, when it comes to tumor, what we basically understand is that tumor can be of two types. It can either be benign tumor or it could be malignant tumor. Now, if it is benign tumor, then in that case, it remains localized. All right, it remains localized, and then this is a problem which is easy to solve. And that's why this is fairly treatable, and it does not spread. It remains localized, does not spread. Whereas in case of malignant tumor, this is what becomes a challenge because this spreads. Now, if this cancer, basically malignant tumor, if it spreads, this is something that can create a challenge, and this is what we need to treat. This is where all the medical therapies, the radiation therapies, chemotherapy, etc., they are all useful in this particular scenario. Now, when it comes to this cancer, what we understand is that the number of cancer cases have been increasing, and this is what basically the article has been talking about. That even if, for example, let's say if free treatments are even available in the government facilities, they might ask for a long, huge amount of time before that radiation therapy can happen for you. So, for example, one of the cases that has been stated in this particular article is about a person who has been given a waiting period of 6 months of time before the procedure for the person could be started. So 6 months of time is a big number, right? 6 months. And because these kind of diseases, especially a disease like cancer, it's about how early can you treat it. If you are able to treat it very fast, it will be able to, you perhaps will be able to get rid of it. But if you keep on delaying it, it becomes even more difficult to treat it, and almost impossible for makes it impossible for a person to even survive if it has been largely delayed. So that's why 6 months waiting period is a big waiting period. At the same time, even some of the cases that have been discussed in the article is about the waiting period of even getting the lab test results back. That, for example, if you go, what has been quoted in this article is that if you go to a private firm and get that lab test done, they might charge you rupees 300, but at least they'll give you back the lab reports in time, maybe within a day itself. Whereas when it comes to the facilities where the free treatments are available, it can take up to 10 days of time only to get back the reports, and based on those reports only, the next procedure for chemotherapy, etc., have to be aligned. So that's why this is where the problems are being spoken of. At the same time, the financial burden meaning that a lot of people might have to just leave their homes, and they might have to come to bigger towns and cities to get the treatment done. They might have had to leave their jobs back and come here and maybe work at a very marginal salary just to make their ends meet. So there are all these issues that, for example, one of the examples that have been quoted in this article is about a person saying that my son earns almost around 1500 rupees, out of which 15,000 rupees, and 7,000 just goes in our rent or in our housing. So we are left with just 8,000 rupees, and we have to do everything in that 8,000, which is almost impossible for us. So that's why we need to understand that when it comes to solving these larger issues that are grappling the country right now, we need to understand the financial burden, and we need to take care of those financial burdens. Now, one thing when it comes to a disease like cancer, there is a larger topic that we need to understand, that when we are saying that the number of cases of cancer are rising, it's not only the number of cases of cancer, but the number of cases of the non-communicable diseases in general. The burden of non-communicable diseases in general, we see that this has been rising. The number of these cases has been rising, and many of these diseases, which are also called as lifestyle diseases, many of these diseases that are called as lifestyle diseases, the number of these diseases have been rising. The number of these diseases have been rising, and that is something that is causing a lot of issues, because lifestyle diseases, meaning that these are diseases that are caused because of improper lifestyle, maybe bad food habits, bad sleeping habits, lack of exercise, lack of physical activities, all these kind of things, or even external factors like pollution. All these are leading to a lot of external problems, a lot of diseases that were never seen. So for example, a lot of these non-communicable diseases are often seen in people who are old, were often seen in people who are old, 50, 60, 70, 80 years of age. But now we have started seeing that a lot of these issues are actually also grappling people just who are in their 20s or 30s. So that's the issue that we are looking at, whether it is about obesity, whether it is about type 2 diabetes, whether it is about cardiovascular diseases, etc. Even the number of cancer cases, we see that they all have been, their numbers have been rising even in young population. So that is what becomes very big challenge right now, and we need to understand this. At the same time, even the respiratory diseases or cancer, all these can be counted here. So whether it is type 2 diabetes, whether it is about the cancers, or even the respiratory diseases that are increasing in their numbers. So there are all these issues that we have, all these diseases that we need to understand. Also, obesity also can be counted here. Cardiovascular diseases are the biggest contributors. So there are all these issues that we need to understand from the perspective of the threat of non-communicable diseases as well. So these are the bigger topics that we had in today's lecture. Now coming to some of the other issues and something that will keep on developing, and also news articles that are small but also important for your examination. Now this article, there are two articles which have a similar context, and these are articles that we have on page number 1 and article on page number 5. So the article on page number 1 that we have here is that governor cannot withhold repassed bills, is what the Supreme Court has said. So this is one article, and then secondly, Supreme Court seeks Kerala government's reply on petition against pending bills. So these are two articles that are there. Now again, this is basically an article which is related to the same controversy, where we have seen a lot of other articles also, other news also that you might have seen in the last 5-7 odd years, where the issue between the Delhi Chief Minister and Delhi government also has been raised. And apart from that, some of these other states also, like in Kerala, in Tamil Nadu, in Telangana, in all these states also have been raised. So basically is about what are the powers of governor versus what exactly can governor do in these kind of situations. So now in these two cases, what we see is that the context is almost similar, that here we are talking about, for example, in case of Tamil Nadu, government's argument regarding Governor R.N. Ravi's authority to withhold approval for 10 bills that have been repassed by the state legislative assembly. So now in this particular scenario, what we are basically saying is that there are bills that have been repassed. I mean, they were sent back to the Legislative Assembly, and they have been repassed by the Legislative Assembly, sent back to the governor, but the governor still hasn't given the approval. Still the assent has not been given by the governor. So now this is basically what has been seen in this particular context. Now what the Supreme Court basically has said in this particular scenario is that once it has been repassed, once it has been given to the governor cannot reject it back, and it has to be seen similar to the money bills. We have to see it similar to the money bills, and that's why it's something that the governor cannot reject. Once it has been passed, it has been passed on to the governor for assent. The governor cannot reject it after that. So that is what basically the Supreme Court had said in this particular scenario. Now when it comes to the case that we see in Kerala, what we basically see is that there also the governor has been holding on to a lot of approvals that were supposed to be given, and that is where the issues have been raised by the government of Kerala also in the same context. And in this particular scenario also, when it comes to the reasons have not been very clear. So for example, let's say in case of Tamil Nadu, the only note that was passed on by the governor while not passing these bills was that he simply said that I withhold consent. So he did not just give the context of why, but he just passed on with a note. So that is basically where they are raising these issues in the context of, for example, Article 200, where basically we are talking about what the powers of states are versus what the powers of the governor is. Now in this particular context, what we also see is that there are a lot of issues that have been raised by the government of Kerala in this context of this article, where they have said that it's when it comes to the assent that has to be given by the governor, they cannot withhold it because it also is related to people. All these bills are meant for the welfare of people, and because they are meant for welfare of people, they basically are challenging the fundamental rights by not passing this bill. So once the bill is passed, it is something that will help the people of the state, and hence by not doing that, you are denying that right to the people. You are denying that right to the people, and that's why in that context basically they have raised those issues. So that's why it becomes very, very crucial to understand from this perspective that how situations have to be read in this. And again, this will be a story that will keep developing in the coming days also. But remember the factors that we are talking about here, that how exactly, for example, in this context, Article 168 has been raised. That Article 168, where it says that the governor has to be seen as a part of the state legislature. So if the governor is a part of state legislature, the governor cannot basically go against or go contrary to the wishes of the elected representatives. So that's why in the context of Article 168, the governor also has to provide the required accent. At the same time, there are two contexts in which it has been raised. One is Article 14 and the another one is Article 21. That how there is a violation of Article 14, that is basically right to equality, and Article 21, that is right to life. That in these two contexts also there is a violation of these two, because you are denying people their chance to get those welfare schemes for them. So that's why we see that in the context of Article 168, Article 200, Article 14 and Article 21, we need to understand this, and the powers of governor versus the state. So that is the context of this. Then there is a small development here that we are looking at, and this is the draft National Pharmacy Commission bill that was released yesterday by the government. Now here what they basically are saying is that there are, when it comes to the context of this bill, there are certain points that have been kept in as a part of bill, and now it is available for public discussion, that public comment basically, that all these, there are different provisions that we have as a part of this bill, and this is where we see that the public comment is now awaited by the government. So this again will be a developing story. So for example, improving the access to affordable and high quality pharmacy education, ensuring the availability of pharmacy professionals across the country, promoting equitable healthcare by making pharmacy services accessible to all the citizens, then periodic and transparent assessment of pharmacies institutions. So there are all these different aspects of the bill that have been presented as a part of this new bill that has been the draft National Pharmacy Commission bill. Now in this particular scenario, what we also see that it is also looking at a replacement of the 1948 law that we have, or the Pharmacy Act of 1948, because and there are a lot of updations that have been proposed in this. So again, this will be a developing story in the coming days, so just have or keep following this. And then lastly, again, one very important topic from the perspective of your GS paper 3, and this is that more finance is needed to wean India's electricity grid of coal. Now here what we are basically talking about, that India needs to do more if we want to get away from coal, if we want to get away from the dependency on coal, because we are nearing the targets that we had kept for 2030, and the world is nowhere near when it comes to achieving those targets. So for example, when it comes to the context of India, you might know that the target that we have kept for 2030, right, the target that we have kept for 2030, so the 2030 target that we have basically is that we want up to 500 gigawatt of renewable energy, right? 500 gigawatt of renewable energy targets have been put for 2030. Now getting to this 500 gigawatt is not going to be easy. At the end of 2022, we were approximately at 168 gigawatt, and this is also counting the hydroelectricity, the big hydroelectricity power plants and nuclear energy. Counting all this also, we see that we were at 168 gigawatt. Now our target, next target that we have, this is for 2030, is of 500 gigawatt. So getting there is not going to be easy, but at the same time, it's not only about improving upon all the renewable energy sources that we have, but also decreasing our dependence on coal. Now what's happening here is that our dependency on coal is not decreasing, because we still see that whenever our demand rises, whenever our demand for electricity energy rises, we see that coal is what supplies that energy, because all the other sources of energy, what we are doing here is that we are actually improving upon the installed capacity. Now here in this context, we need to understand this word installed capacity. Installed capacity. So installed capacity is the total capacity that you might have. So for example, let's say we have any new power plant being set up. Let's say there is a solar power plant being set up, and solar power plant has an installed capacity of 10 megawatt. So it might have an installed capacity of 10 megawatt, but it might be possible that the actual production could be just 2 to 3 megawatt. So we do not know what the actual production is, because actual production is dependent on a lot of factors. So for example, let's say if the climatic conditions are bad, the weather conditions, let's say, are bad, you have a cloudy weather for a prolonged period of time, then obviously what happens is that your real production will be very low. Although your installed capacity was very high, but your actual production will be very low. So that is what happens in a case of a lot of these sectors, where we see that our installed capacity is good, is high, but the actual production levels are pretty low. So that is one of the basic issues that we are looking at. At the same time, what we see is that our dependency on coal has not been dropping. That although if you look at the final reports, report wise, it just suggests that we have been able to drop our dependence on coal from almost 70% to almost 55 to 60% now, and we want that our total consumption or our total non-renewable or coal and petroleum-based energy consumption should not be more than 50% by 2030. So by 2030, we want that more than 50% of our energy needs should be taken care of by renewable energy sources and not coal and petroleum. So that's why we see that there are all these things that we want, but we are not really looking at a scenario where we can achieve it. For example, when we look at 2023, the peak demand that we saw in 2023 has been 234 gigawatt. 234 gigawatt. This is, we are talking about India, and where we saw that almost 70% of it still came from coal. 70% of it still was taken care of by coal and not the other sources. Although the annual reports of Ministry of Coal says that our dependence on coal has dropped down to almost 55%, but we yet saw that when we had a higher demand, when it came to higher demand, it's simply the fact that the demand could only be taken care of by coal. And this is where the problems are, because when we are looking at the world, all right, so at world level, when we are looking to limit global warming, what we want, you might know that we want to limit global warming. We want to limit global warming to not more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? We want to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, when we look at limiting this number, we need to decrease our emissions. We need to decrease emissions by 43%. We need to decrease our emissions by 43% worldwide. I am talking about the world, that the world needs to decrease its emission by 43%. Whereas when we look at what's going on at the pace that we are going on, it is estimated that we'll be able to decrease it by only 2% by 2030. So we want to decrease it by almost 43% by 2030, and with the pace at which we are going, we might be able to do that only by 2%. So that's the kind of difference that we are looking at when it comes to decreasing our emissions. So that's why from this perspective, we need to understand that although we have all the plans in place, we have all the targets in place, but when we are looking at the ground reality, whether it is India or worldwide, we see that the efforts are not enough. The efforts are not enough, and we need to do more. And this is in the context of COP28. This is which is supposed to happen next month in Dubai. That where all these numbers are again going to come back, and they are going to haunt countries like India, where if you need more energy and if you need more investment in the energy sector, you need to show that you are actually going in the positive direction. And this is where we see that there are a lot of issues that right now we are facing, and we need to understand all these problems also in the context of our dependence on the non-renewable sources like coal. Because it's not even that coal, you know that coal is a finite source and you're not going to have coal for a very long time. There will be an increase in price that will keep happening with coal, and that overall will lead to energy consumption also decreasing, because you will not have enough money. Otherwise, what happens is that this is going to increase your spending on energy, which is again going to increase inflation altogether. So there will be a lot of issues that these kind of scenarios can create if we do not start moving away from coal very quickly. So that's why in this context, this is supposed to be understood when it comes to this topic. And again, this again will be a developing topic, because COP28 is supposed to happen next month in Dubai, and then there will be a lot of outcomes that we'll be discussing post that. So this is about today's session. I hope that this session helps you. There are these 6 topics that we discussed. Please go through the details of these and also link it to your static portions so that you can read them together and revise them together. So with this, I'm ending this lecture today. Thank you very much for joining. Do subscribe our channel, do like the video and comment about all our videos. Please share it with all your aspirants as well, all your friends and family, so that we can also improve our reach. Thank you very much.